Hi friends, happy Thursday. I'm here with chapter 15 of Beyond the Bright Sea. By the time we'd sailed through the Narrows and into the harbor, we had 12 big lobsters in a bushel basket fitted with a lid. Osh pulled up the centerboard as we came into the shore alongside the fish pier. I lowered the sail and scrambled out of the skiff, towing it into the shallows, where Osh stepped out and hoisted the dripping basket onto his shoulder. I pulled the skiff higher onto the sand and tied it to a post. Then I followed Osh up the pier lane toward the grocery. I expected to find some islanders on the porch, sharing news and gossip, and maybe even a few summer people come to start the season early. I often saw them at the grocery, packing picnic baskets with cold soda pop and thick sandwiches. The ladies in pretty dresses and straw hats, the men in dark trousers, white jackets, and fedoras. But there were no summer people on the porch when we arrived, just Mr. Benson, who was one of the many Cutty-Hunk pilots who guided ships coming through the graveyard. As Osh climbed the steps to the porch, Mr. Benson said, "Daniel." Osh said, "Benson." I stayed in the yard, on the other side of the porch rail out of habit. "Good morning, Crow," Mr. Benson said. He was sitting in one of the rockers, packing his pipe with tobacco from a pouch. "Good morning, Mr. Benson." Osh left the lobsters on the porch and went inside to settle up with Mr. Higgins, the grocer. He usually took his pay in trade: flour, coffee, spice, dried bean, and canned goods, or put it on account for a day when we needed more than lobsters would buy. "I hear you've been to Penikese," Mr. Benson said. He looked at me curiously. "And writing letters to the doctor that used to be there." I wasn't sure I liked people knowing my business. I hated the thought of islanders talking about me as if I were news. Before I could decide how to reply, Mr. Benson went on to say, "The gamekeeper over there said the doctor disinfected every last thing before he left. Don't know why he'd bother. They should have burned every bit down of it straight away." He seemed to be saying that nothing from that place should be allowed to remain, although I'd never known him to be mean. "The bird keeper told you that? About the leper doctor?" I said. Mr. Benson nodded. "He moved into the hospital after they cleaned it up. Used to come over from time to time for a square meal and a chat, though he hasn't been lately." He gave a snort of laughter. "Perfect fellow for the job. Looks like excuse me. Looks like a sandpiper, head to toe." "How do you mean?" "Little skinny fella," Mr. Benson said, "with a nose like a beak." I pictured the big, flat-faced man we'd met on Penikese. "From down south?" I said. Mr. Benson shook his head. "A Mainer," he said, "born and raised." Not the birdman we'd met out there. Not even close. Osh came through the door with a sack of groceries. "Benson," he said, passing by. "Daniel," Mr. Benson said, nodding. "Crow." And we headed back down the lane toward the skiff. I let my feet decide where to put themselves as I followed Osh down to the beach, my mind busy with other things. If the bird keeper was a little fellow from Maine, then who was the big southern man we'd met? As we'd sailed back through the Narrows and toward home, I told Osh what Mr. Benson said. "Maybe the old bird keeper left and the one we met came out to take his place," Osh said. Which was possible, I suppose, but my gut told me a different story, and I decided to listen to it. It did rain all afternoon that night, and into the morning, too. Not a gale, just a long gray rain that fell straight and soft on a flat sea. Osh decided I should go to Miss Maggie's for lessons. "She'll come out here if you don't go there first," he said, and I knew he was right. Rain always brought her to our door, draped in a long oilskin, skirts wet from crossing over, save her from getting soaked. So I put on my own poncho, pulled up the hood, and headed out into the gray. It was mid-tide, so I was not much wet when I made land, and was otherwise dry inside my poncho. The rain on my hood made the world very small, and I found myself filled with thoughts as I walked. When I reached Maggie's place, it was empty, which was odd on a day like this. "Miss Maggie!" I called, wandering around the barn and in where the horses and cows were staying dry on days like these. Mouse was waiting for me in one of the stalls, curled up in the manger. "Mouse," she said when she saw me, lean in over the half door. "Good morning, Mouse," I said. "Good morning, Cinders," which she answered with a snort and a shake of her head. "Where's Miss Maggie?" But they did not know, or they would not answer. I asked her milk cows, too, but they just blinked their big peaceful eyes at me. I looked all around the barn calling, but no one else was there. At the big door I could see sheep grazing in the distance, and beyond them Miss Maggie coming home. I went out to meet her halfway. With all the rain and the hood shadowing her face, I couldn't see her tears, but I could hear her crying. Her hands were brown with mud. "Hawks," she said, "or maybe an owl. Something got Snowdrop and she's dead." She was talking about the littlest of lambs, still small and frail, while the others had grown to be sturdy young sheep, full of play. Miss Maggie rarely named the lambs, since it was harder to butcher with something with a name. But she'd intended to keep Snowdrop for her wool alone. Now, something else had done the butchering. "I buried what was left of her," Miss Maggie said, marching past me. "Come help me with the grooming." I followed her toward the barn, and I thought of the headstone on Pennakees, the little lamb carved there. And suddenly my own 12 years felt like a long time, as if I were young and old at once. Inside the barn we shut our ponchos, and armed with a curry comb and a dandy brush, each took a horse, Cinders for me, a roan named Clover in the next stall for Maggie. While we worked, mostly because we had things to say, but also because it calmed the horses. They loved the grooming, but sometimes they were a little shy of the dandy brush when we came close to tender spots. I told Miss Maggie about the sailboat leaving Pennakees at dusk, and how Mr. Benson described the gamekeeper. "That man we met was no sandpiper," I said, "more like a bulldog." "Well, it's odd, I'll admit that, but does it matter?" she said. "I don't see what any of that has to do with you or what you want there." So I told her about the thump I'd heard at the hospital. "Osh thought it might be a cat jumping or the building making its own noise," I said, "but I don't think so." Silence for a while, nothing but the sound of the horses shifting as we worked. Miss Maggie sneezing at the dust stirred up by the dandy brush. "So, what do you intend to do about it?" she asked. I didn't need to think about my answer. "Go back out there," I said, "and look for some more." "For what?" "For whatever I can," I said. "There's something I'm supposed to do, I just don't know what it is." After a bit, Miss Maggie said, "Perhaps it's time to let that go. Maybe tell your heart to listen to your brain for a change." I didn't like that advice. I soaked a rag, wrung it out, and began to wash Cinder's face. "Why were you crying about Snowdrop?" I asked. After a moment, Miss Maggie stepped into the doorway of the stall. "Of all people, you should know the answer to that." I stopped what I was doing and turned to face her. "I do," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "All right," she finally said, nodding. She returned to Clover, and I could hear him shifting and sighing as she worked on his dusty coat. "When do you mean to go back out there?" she said through the wall. "As soon as the rain stops." After a moment, she appeared in the doorway again. "I'll be waiting at the neck," she said briskly, "and tell Osh the garden can look after itself for a little while." "The garden needs tending," Osh said when I proposed sailing to Pennakees as soon as the weather cleared. "Miss Maggie said it can look after itself for a while." He was filling a pail with wood ash from the fireplace. He used it to feed the plants and frustrate the slugs. "She did she?" He climbed to his feet and dusted off his hands. "And I suppose she'll be coming with us again." There, he would go, I smiled, of course. Like the musketeers. "All for one," he said. "She'll be waiting at the neck when it stops raining." And later that day, when the clouds tore apart in the freshening breeze, she was. All right, so now that we know that there are two men, that man that they met was not the bird keeper. So who do you think that man was? Have a great night, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.